Joining us now, Congressman, Republican, 1st District, Dr. Rob Wittman. He is the now ranking member of the Sea Power Readiness Subcommittee in the House of Representatives. Dr. Wittman, great to have you.
Good morning, John. Great to be with you this morning.
Now you're a star. You have been clamoring. I don't know, how long have you been coming on my show, Rob? 8 years every Friday, right? It's a record.
Yes.
8 years. Every Friday at 8:05, you can set your clock. Congressman Wittman calls in the show, except if he's out of the country or on vacation with his family. He calls in. There's no agenda. He's not asking for, what are the topics of the day. 8:05, he calls in. Every week, 8 years. Now, for this whole period of time, what you've been saying is if there's no budget, congressmen shouldn't get paid because, that's their number one job. And so you cut their pay and you send them home without a budget. You're going to get a budget. Now, Florida former governor Rick Scott comes into the Senate, waltzes in. He's there 2 days. And he says, boy, this is pretty crazy. I ran a business, and when you don't do your job, you don't get paid. So as long as there's a shutdown, I'm putting in this bill that says, well, Congress, Senate, U.S. representatives, senators shouldn't get a paycheck, and it shouldn't be retroactive either. You just don't get paid because the government is shut down, and that's your, number one responsibility. Now, this is going to be interesting to see where this goes because, Rick Scott is a pretty powerful guy, and in Florida he was a governor, big win down there in the Senate, knocked off an incumbent. You think this thing will ever see the light of day, Congressman?
Well, I think it should. I think that this idea is gaining more and more steam. I know, John, as I talk to folks not just in the 1st District, but across Virginia and across the nation, they see it just as a common sense mode of operation that Congress should be operating under. It's pretty clear, as Rick Scott said, when you're in business, if you're not doing business, you don't get paid. And the same ought to be held for Congress in the things that they're required to do. If you don't get the job done, you shouldn't get a paycheck, period. No deferral, no nothing, no paycheck. Now, I understand that there's a constitutional issue to be able to take the pay away, but it should at least be that you don't get a paycheck for the work that hasn't been done. This should be pay for performance. And as you know, I've been advocating for this now for the past 5 years. I think also members of Congress should not get to go home during August. Many of the members use that as vacation. Shouldn't get that recess unless everything on our plate as far as these appropriations bills are done. I mean, if we did that, we would avoid what we find ourselves in now, in a situation where there is a shutdown and no intent prior to that to try to resolve these things. The time to come to the bottom line and find the places where we can actually get things done is before you have the end of the budget year, before funding runs out, before now you have these high-stakes shutdown politics. If you want to be able to resolve things and sit down in a room and actually have rational conversations and work through it, you do it before the end of the fiscal year. You don't do it after the end of the fiscal year. People don't look at putting together successful business plans after their fiscal year is over. What do? They put it together beforehand. They put their plans out there so that they can be successful. Congress ought to be required to do the same thing. And the same if there is a shutdown. Many of the members, myself included, are having their pay withheld during this shutdown, but not all members. I think it ought to be a requirement that if the government does shut down, members of Congress do not get paid, period, no exceptions. And that also is a outcome of the downside for members of Congress if the job doesn't get done. I think members of Congress need to suffer the consequences for not getting the job done, and that's where we seem to find ourselves year after year after year. And as you know, these situations are totally avoidable if we actually sit down beforehand and work through these issues and are forced to get legislation passed. And that gets people to sit down in a bipartisan way and find solutions and actually get the work of the nation done, which is what people put us in Washington to do. I mean, this is fundamental to what Congress needs to be doing. Unfortunately, the dysfunction in there leads us to these shutdown scenarios, it seems like year after year after year.
It's a tired script. It plays out the same way, but everybody gets paid. And the fact that, Congress people like yourself, and, even though you can say, well, I voluntarily am not going to take my check, that's fine. But when you're in a position where it's simply not coming and it's not retroactive, like you're not going to get back pay, then I think that changes. To me, that's just a no-brainer. So Scott is going to put this in the Senate. It's going to be interesting to see what Leader McConnell does with it. Is there a counterpart to this in the House, Congressman Wittman?
Well, certainly our bills are the counterpart to it. I'm part of another bill that in a shutdown scenario, members of Congress do not get paid. Of course, my No Budget, No Pay Act says members don't get paid if a budget isn't adopted on time. And then the Stay on Schedule Act says no August recess unless you get unless all the work is done prior to the end of July or the beginning of the August recess period. So, there are comparable bills in the House. It would be nice if there was a groundswell of support, not just in Virginia, but across the United States, demanding that these bills come to the floor and demanding that they be voted on. So I think that those things are a great way for us to be able to, make sure that members of Congress suffer the consequences for not getting the job done. And right now, there's not a whole lot of downside individually for members of Congress when these things happen. I think that it's a way to fix at least some of the dysfunction there that occurs with the process. So this really is, a process-related reform. And I know process doesn't excite people, but I think in this instance it should, because this should be something where folks across the country contact their members and say, have you signed on to the No Budget, No Pay Act? Have you signed on to the Stay on Schedule Act? Have you signed on to whatever bills are out there that say that members of Congress do not get paid if budgets aren't adopted on time, if appropriations bills aren't adopted on time, if there's a government shutdown, pay ought to automatically be withheld. It shouldn't be, individual members saying some do, some don't. So I think doing those things can at least put members of Congress on notice personally that they will be faced with the consequences for not doing their job.
At the very least, that's the thing. At the very least, you shouldn't get paid when the government is shut down. Last weekend, 30 Democrats go on a lobbyist, 109-person strong lobbyist junket on a charter jet to Puerto Rico. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, frolicking around with his shirt off, having a good old time at the beach. Meantime, people aren't getting paid. And then your speaker says, well, I'm just not going to negotiate. Screw you. The partisanship is asinine. Just go in there and cut a deal. It's $5 million. And there's no reason why you simply can't go in, sit down, and like the president says, and I saw him yesterday in the Oval Office, like he says, 15 minutes, this thing is done. It's just not that big a deal, but they're not going to do it. Okay, Congressman, let's start with the State of the Union. Nancy Pelosi cancels it, your speaker, and says, there's a shutdown, no State of the Union, even though I invited you, now I'm disinviting you. And it's for security reasons. Well, it took about an hour and a half. And Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristen Nielsen, who was in charge of security for the Congress and the State of the Union, says, no, we got plenty of security. I already checked it out. By the way, that's my jurisdiction, Mr. Speaker, not yours. And so no problem with security, but she doesn't rescind the rescission. This is so ridiculous. And then the president says, well, okay, that bus you guys are taking to that government chartered plane to the Middle East, no, we're not going to do that. You really need to stay here in Washington and negotiate with me. You're welcome to take a commercial flight. There might be a middle seat available someplace. What do you make of this whole thing?
Well, this is high stakes back and forth. The president, is directed to give a State of the Union address. Now, he doesn't have to give it in person, but that's been the way it's been done going back to the days of Woodrow Wilson. And I do think it's something that the Congress likes to hear from the president, regardless of the party. And, obviously there's always a difference of opinion about what this president states in the State of the Union address, depending on your perspective. But I do think it's an important part of what the nation expects from the executive branch. That's why it is a requirement that the president give that State of the Nation. Now, as I said, it's not required that he come and give it before Congress. I think there are a lot of opportunities for the president to provide a State of the Nation address, and it doesn't necessarily have to be before the House. But I think it creates unnecessary divisions there when the president, regardless of whether the other side agrees with him or not, I do think he is bound to come in and give a report about the state of our union. Now, I know the president will obviously find other opportunities to be able to do that. I do think that the speaker needs to look at where we are right now in this government shutdown and look at the idea of traveling at this particular time, especially since the negotiation really needs to be between her, Senator Schumer, and the president to be able to resolve this impasse. To leave for 7 days and say, well, I'm just not even going to enter into any type of negotiations is not what the American people expect. I mean, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. I've heard from countless people that have said, hey, just get this done. People need to sit down in a room, work through this, as you said. There may be a difference of opinion about, what a wall or barrier would be, what you would call it, what would it look like, how many dollars would you spend on it. But you have to be able to come in and give a concrete counteroffer. You can't just say, no, I'm not going to negotiate, no, nothing whatsoever. I mean, that's not the way our government is designed to work. Our government's designed to work for there to be differences of opinion, but for those differences of opinion to be worked on, for people to come to the table. And the president's already offered. He said, listen, I'm willing to meet somewhere in between, but yeah, I can't negotiate against myself. I have to have somebody in the room where you can actually put a concrete proposal on the table, right, work through those issues, and be able to get things done. And I think that's where things are right now. And the back and forth, I think needs to result in getting something done. I understand both sides are back and forth on this. It's become 100% political now. And it needs to be 100% about getting the job done, and I think that's where we find ourselves. I think, members on both sides of the aisle. I've talked to a number of members both sides of the aisle, House and Senate, and there's a desire to say, let's find the place where we can be to be able to do border security, including barriers, to do it in the right way. There's other things that the Democrats want that I think we can find common ground on. There are things that Republicans want that we can find common ground on. Right. We can find a place to get this funded and get it done. Pretty simple and straightforward. And you're right. I think the president's right. If you have serious negotiators willing to sit down in the room, in 30 minutes you could find a common ground place on this and get it done.
It's 30 minutes. And I was with the president yesterday in the Oval Office. He was in a great mood, and, his spirits are high. He's very enthusiastic, as you know. I know you've talked to him recently about the future and the accomplishments and the things he's doing, and he's really excited about going forward. All this talk about the dark clouds over the West Wing. I mean, I've seen him 2 times in the last 3 weeks, front and center, up close. Exact opposite. It's exact opposite of what the legacy fake news media is telling you. You're on the John Fredericks Radio Network. We're trucking the truth across America. I'm your Godzilla of the truth right here. We're with Republican Congressman Rob Wittman. He's from the 1st District of Virginia. That's Central Virginia, right in the middle of our radio heartbeat for all the stations we own. He's right front and center of it. We thank him for that. And also, Rob Wittman is, Dr. Wittman is the ranking member. For those of you that don't know him, he's the ranking member of the subcommittee on sea power readiness. So, Dr. Wittman, Morgan Griffith, your colleague, Salem, Southwest Virginia, which, by the way, I'm heading there right after the show. I'm taking my son to Radford University for the weekend for a baseball camp for hitting, says that he had the best line of the week. He said, Pelosi doesn't want to negotiate with the president because she's scared to death he'll say yes. True or false?
Oh, I think that this is, as I said, I think this is all about politics, and I think that that you'll find a very willing negotiator with the president, and unfortunately, I think sometimes the calculation is that doing nothing is better than doing something, and I think that's unfortunate. And again, that comes down to Pelosi looking at this as a political back and forth, and that somehow that they win politically if nothing gets done. I think that's completely the opposite. I think the nation loses. I think both sides do not gain by getting nothing done. So I think that, in any type of serious negotiation, and again, we haven't heard any plan from the other side. Speaker Pelosi yesterday made a comment when someone says, "Well, are you willing to negotiate?" She says yes, but she hasn't gone to the White House. They haven't made any kind of counter proposal. When the president asked her, "Listen, if I open up the government for 30 days, where will we be with funding the wall or the barrier in 30 days? Will you be willing to fund that?" And Pelosi says no. And then earlier, she said not a dollar, and has been adamant about that. That is not anybody that's interested in negotiating. It's not anybody who's interested in a final resolution to this particular issue. And the president has a concrete proposal out there talking about some things that could be part of this negotiation. Now, there's only so far that he can go because you can't negotiate against yourself. But I think he's indicated a willingness in saying, "Hey, I'm here at the White House." If you noticed, he's been there waiting for the other side. He had the Problem Solvers Caucus in the other day, members on both sides of the aisle. And as I have talked to and heard from others, there is a desire from folks on both sides of the aisle, House and Senate, to resolve this issue. But it boils down to the leadership on the Democrat side has to also be willing to resolve the issue. They have to be willing to sit down and negotiate. And you can't negotiate to a resolution of this if you have one side that's unwilling to negotiate. And the president,
no, then there's no negotiation.
Hey, let's sit down and get this done.
I mean, that's exactly it, and that's the president's position. Come into my office and work it out. And as Congressman Griffith says, she's afraid he'll say yes. I got to go. We're out of time. Go to Wittman.house.gov, Wittman.house.gov.